And the minute you allow some slop, be it human generated or AI generated, then the ball rolls downhill. New engineers come on and then they reproduce that slop and it keeps getting worse.
Today's guest is Tommy Sullivan, CTO of Vidio, Indonesia's #1 streaming platform. Tommy has spent over a decade building world-class engineering culture from the ground up in Southeast Asia.
When you came here, maybe not enough good engineers available. How do you actually overcome that?
Indonesia went through a lot of brain drain early on. We had a team of about 5 people. Several of them were on minimum wage. It's better to find people who are hungry and who are smart and who are growing and learning, hire for attitude and not just pure aptitude. Feedback is a core principle of extreme programming. And feedback in terms of the code that you're writing, in terms of having a CI that's running all of those tests, in terms of if you are pair programming or working very closely with people.
I myself also fear one day I'll be obsolete. Would you think now that with this AI you don't need so many engineers?
Writing code becomes more commoditized. Many aspects of extreme programming are still valid, but other aspects in terms of building a product are becoming more valued. My conversation with the business is all of look at all of these opportunities that we can pursue we wouldn't otherwise be able to. I too feel a little bit disheartened in terms of the amount of time that I've spent coding, that syntax is no longer important. But I need to also remember that, wow, I can have an idea now and get it out so much more easily. People need to be cognizant of the Gartner hype cycle. It's a great time to get experience and to play with all the things that are developing in AI. When you technically have an understanding of how they operate, nothing is magic in tech. The whole OpenClaw thing is essentially markdown files. The limit is not sentience, but markdown files.
Yeah.
Hey, quick pause. My goal with Tech Lead Journal is simple. Learn from the best in tech so we can all grow together. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe to follow the channel. It's the biggest way for you to support the show and help us keep bringing great guests and insights to you. Thanks for being here, and let's get back to it.
All right, so thank you so much for your time, Tommy. Today we are going to talk a lot about building engineering culture at Vidio, also some of your stories. So yeah, welcome to the Tech Lead Journal.
Hopefully stories and jokes. We can mix them all up.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So for people who don't know Tommy yet, Tommy is the CTO at Vidio. Vidio is actually one of the largest OTT or streaming platform in Southeast Asia. So it's actually a pleasure to meet Tommy. So we had a connection through Mohan. Yeah. Mohan is my past episodes. So always a pleasure to have, people who are doing great things in engineering around this region.
Well, I'm glad that I knew about the Tech Lead Journal before Mohan introduced me to it.
All right.
But I'm glad also I have a bit of an opportunity to rebuttal anything that he said without him being able to, to complain. But yeah, it's so thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's start maybe a bit from your story. Like, how did you end up here? I think if I'm not mistaken, you have spent over than 10 years being in Indonesia. So someone who grew up in US, how did you end up here?
Well, I started out working for kind of a dev shop in San Francisco, and right after CMU, after college, then I was working at a dev shop, and there I had the opportunity to work on a project with a much better dev shop, and around that time, this is around 2009, and kind of in the middle of hyperscaling in SF area in terms of like Facebook and Zynga and all of those things were blowing up, and this is also like right past 2008 financial crisis,
right?
And so I was just starting my career, and I was working at, again, I say dev shop somewhat pejoratively in the sense that a place that's mostly focused on like getting something out, just getting it done, focused on the result, not necessarily how it happened. And I worked on a project with some engineers from Pivotal. And at that time, I saw the work that they were producing and how they were essentially like craftsmen in the truest sense of the word. And it was inspiring. Around that same time, I also had the opportunity, I was interviewing with Pivotal and interviewing with Airbnb. And, I had the experience of working in that dev shop and seeing how a small group of engineers, like if you're going to be a junior on a team, you could potentially be at the whim of whatever your team lead or the CTO wants to do that could be a good idea. And actually, I have no scars on that for my first company, but I saw how they controlled the tech stack, the decisions and that culture. And I was while I was, talking with Brian and Nathan and the early group at Airbnb, I was a bit cautious of joining a 2-3 person engineering team at that time, because I knew that no matter what, they could potentially, steer down a route that who knows. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to join Pivotal, and thinking the long term, what was best for my career, to become a craftsman in software development. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very happy with that decision. No, I certainly would be way richer being the third engineer at Airbnb. But from Pivotal, then we opened an office in Singapore. And Singapore is kind of like Asia 101 in terms of, it's a very comfortable market to get into.
Yeah.
But in Singapore, you also have the entire region's kind of unlocked. It's very close. And so there I was working with Pivotal, consulting with tech companies in the area. And Pivotal is interesting. They do engage for software. They're closed now, but they did engage for software development. But their SVP had a good quote once that was kind of like, if you're engaging with Pivotal just to increase your engineering manpower or to add more devs to your team, you're wasting your money. Mm-hmm. And because it's like the goal of Pivotal was to go in there and to help improve the engineering culture of the teams. Yeah. And so my job as a consultant was to help focus on engineering culture and principles. And so I was doing that throughout the region, and I started doing it with MTech here, with Mohan. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right. I know a few people from Pivotal Labs, and in fact, I used to work at ThoughtWorks as well. I think we kind of admire each other. So we
didn't touch on that.
So we were kind of into craftsmanship, building the right culture, and what you said is right. So they hire Pivotal Labs or ThoughtWorks not just for hiring another engineer, but it's to learn the best practices, inculcate the practices and all that, right? So I think thanks for sharing that, because I'm sure today we'll talk a lot more about building great engineering culture. But maybe let's start from after the story. You come to Indonesia. What did you see here in terms of tech scene back then? And then if you pull it out maybe 10 plus years now, how has the tech scene changed?
It's gone through quite an arc, right? When Mohan and I first came here, it was just as Indonesia was starting to tech boom, all of that, sort of Gojek and Tokopedia, Traveloka, all of these things were at their seed phase, right? And we saw those early teams there. And it was also a lot of, while that was happening, there were also a lot of traditional companies that were trying to digitize and become digital natives and stuff. Yeah. We had Matahari Mall, I remember. They saw Amazon, and back then there was a phrase of them having 500 million that they were investing in terms of just so they were building a product to replace their non-online presence. And they were building 3 at the same time, actually, because they had so little trust that one would be successful, and they had so much money. And that's really hedging bets in terms of just, it shows such a problem with trust of they had a team working on a product, and they had another team working on a competing product that just because they were trying to hedge their bets. And I think that there was an issue with regards to trust and with regards to understanding software engineering. And so when Mohan and I first came here, certainly, I mean, the tech, we had engineers, we had a team of about 5 people when we first joined, and several of them were on minimum wage, and so the scene there then was engineering is just such a side function, and the same as an office boy or something in terms of just, make the website work or whatever. And MTech really invested in engineering with working with Pivotal, and then pulling Mohan and myself in. And we saw, people here working on laptops, laptops connected to monitors, with literally just down the office over here of 12-inch monitors and stuff like that. And it can seem hilarious now, you know.
Yeah.
And I can understand why the company was in a state like that. It's kind of like a vicious cycle, you know. Like you can hire engineers and then they want the fanciest tech and all of these things, but that's just one piece of having like a proper engineering organization, having a proper culture, right? But that cycle is also two parts in the sense that it's the company not necessarily having invested up until that point, but it's also the engineers not investing in themselves to some extent. I want to again normalize that with respect to, you know, a lot socioeconomically, not everyone can afford, you know, a great investment in terms of the proper tech and the computers and all those. But I do think that piece of one sort of thought or thread or theme. One theme that I think that I keep in my mind is the Rifleman's Creed, which is it needs to be taken with a bit of candor, but is that, you know, like this is my rifle, without it I am nothing, without me it is nothing. And I think that as engineers and in tech, our computers are our rifles, you know.
Yeah.
And we need to have the most effective working tools at our disposal. And so the company not investing in them and engineers not investing in themselves for that, I think that that's a perspective change in terms of these tools being so important and investing in oneself and the team. So early on when Moen and I came in, we kind of, that was the tech scene that we were familiar with.
Yeah.
During that time, it was certainly we saw a lot of organizations that were more focused on LinkedIn posts and more focused on what is popular to say versus what they're actually doing. And, you know, I remember early on, we had a lot of poaching happening. You know, we'd hire engineers, you know, develop them, and then organizations would poaching them. In some of the organizations, there was a peer-to-peer lending situation for a while that kind of grew up. There were 300 peer-to-peer apps here, of which only like 200 were approved by OJICA. And all of those organizations were democratizing finance in such an altruistic goal, and yet they were charging 500% APR. And so in some of the, actually at one point, Moen and I had staff that owed significant amount of money there. And we were building a team, the culture, building trust with our engineers, and even Moen donated money to help, you know, pay that debt off with that staff, which I think is just a side effect. It's just a symptom of the trust that we were building with the team and the level of engagement that we were building with the team. Right. And that has served us for years since then.
Yeah, so I believe back then, right, when all this tech scene hasn't really started, right, finding good engineers definitely is very difficult. I mean, once after, you know, the Gojek, the Toko started, investment coming in, I mean, we can see a lot of engineers.
SoftBank, crazy money.
Yeah, a lot of engineers popping up, you know, the salary also increased very high. Yeah. What do you see now? Because, you know, the economy situation, especially in this region, may not be the best at the moment. And also, you know, with technological changes and all that, do you see people are moving off engineering, or, you know, like, what is your sentiment here?
Indonesia went through a lot of brain drain early on. So when we first came here, there was like good engineers in Indonesia were leaving Indonesia because they could make more money in the Bay Area or whatever. And so that was something that certainly suffered. What is actually, I guess, a positive benefit of the crazy money that came in, the SoftBank and all of that, is that a lot of those engineers started coming back because they realized the opportunity. And so those engineers have, you know, Indonesia has even surpassed some of the developing markets in the area, Vietnam, you know, I think of, in Malaysia, in the sense that because VC money and all of this money came in and just saw the crazy opportunity and just kept flooding it to the point where it became a bit of a bubble, in the sense that there was so much growth and opportunity here that it led to essentially organizations that were never going to be profitable and
Yeah.
based on hype more than actual results.
Yeah.
And so now it has kind of come down a bit, and it is, I think that now we're in a more mature phase of tech companies here that are focused on profitability, that are focused on economics.
Right. So maybe for the audience here who are not familiar with Indonesia or this region, right, tell us why the opportunity in Indonesia is such a big deal, especially considering if you look at the global, population and countries, right?
Yeah.
Indonesia is always there, like maybe the digital, social media penetration, number of people, definitely population is huge. What, if you can summarize, what do you think is the opportunity in Indonesia compared to other countries around the region?
I think that there's that funny quote where Indonesia is the country of tomorrow, even tomorrow, with regards to because a lot of times it constantly feels like it has so much opportunity, and sometimes it's not realized, and that opportunity stems from vast natural resources. It comes from a relatively significant middle class. It comes from a huge population. People don't realize fourth largest population in the world. And so VC companies, engineers such as us, see that, if you can have a product or something that sticks here, it can grow so quickly. And Indonesia is actually very liberal with regards to business, I think. It can be, in terms of the employment side, it can be a little tricky in terms of, hiring and firing people is much harder than in the United States or in Vietnam or something like that. And certainly regulations can be tricky, but on the macro scale, the ability for tech penetration is significant. I remember, for example, a concrete example of that is my father was involved in healthcare in the United States. He was the chief doctor for Medicare and Medicaid. And he was working on telemedicine in the United States. And in the United States, your doctor's license is for one state. And so if you want someone in California to consult with someone in Massachusetts, that is a totally different, you need to be, granted your MD but you need to be relicensed in that other state. Whereas Indonesia, it is just the entire archipelago is, and so the ability to, if you have a product or something that is working in Indonesia, I think that you can scale it very quickly.
Right. Yeah, country of tomorrow. I hope tomorrow will come eventually. So thanks for the quote. So let's start into talking about building engineering culture. You mentioned when you came here, maybe not enough good engineers available. You in fact mentioned about 5 people. Some of them are like, kind of like maybe juniors, starting from a very low wage. Maybe my first question, a lot of engineering leaders would be frustrated given this situation. How do you actually overcome that? How do you actually approach this situation? Because you came from Pivotal Labs, I'm sure, like, top of the cream, you work with great engineers, having to face this challenge. Like, what's your approach here for leaders out there who are also maybe in similar situation? They don't have a good tech team, but they are tasked to actually build a great culture. Maybe let's start from there.
So there was a quote I can't attribute, but it was, I think it was Rob Me or someone who was talking about building a team and having the opportunity to hire engineers who are familiar with your tech staff, or hire engineers who aren't in any way familiar with tech staff, but have that quality and that experience, right? And always leading towards the experience and quality, right? And, in terms of hiring engineers, sometimes people can be, okay, I've got a XYZ, tech stack, or I want to build some AI Python stuff, so I need to find AI Python engineers, right? And that is very short-sighted, and it's better to find people who are hungry and who are smart and who are growing and learning, and to then work with them in the tooling that they're familiar with, right? So Mohan and I came in, and we knew we were limited in terms of finding the team. It was more grow the team, right? And part of the extreme programming principles that we brought in from our Pivotal experience was, one fundamental thing was pair programming back then, which is an incredible tool to onboard engineers and to onboard anyone in any process where you do the work together, right? I think that pair programming is certainly changing in this whole, AI world, but in terms of two people sitting together, communicating, discussing the problem at hand, and whichever tools you use to solve that problem changes, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is to find the hire for attitude and not just pure aptitude. There's I think I'm gonna ruin one of your. There's a phrase that's I'd rather have a hole in my team than an asshole in my team, and
Right.
and it's hiring for that fit and letting the team grow, letting the team hire to build that culture that you want. Right. So what we did is we spent a lot of time early on defining the culture that we wanted to have here, and many of that is from extreme programming. Some of that is influenced, from our own experience. A lot of it is around hiring people you want to work with, and that enjoy solving problems. And so we grew the team from about 5 people to at one point 200, and at one point 4 offices, and now we're back down to just one office here in Jakarta. But it's still a great team, and I think that the average tenure of the engineers on my team, which is about 7 years, is indicative of we've succeeded in that regard.
Right.
I think another aspect, I guess, just that I take a bit of pride in the team that we built is early on when we were here, we were engaging headhunters, right, to help find engineers, and one of them was Geek Camp, not Geek Camp, sorry, Geek Hunter. And we were working with them to find engineers, and in their onboarding form of applying to use them as a headhunter, they had an input box that was with regards to which company would you like to kind of potentially poach from, and what type of engineers. And I'm very proud that their number one input was our company at that time. So the results kind of showed there.
Right. I think it's always great if you can build culture from the ground up, right? You shape the people that you hire with and all that. I want to go back a little bit on the pair programming that you mentioned, right? Because I don't know, like these days it's not well covered because of the AI and all that stuff, right? But I know that Pivotal Labs actually practice it like very religiously. In fact, I heard like 8 hours, the whole working day is actually to sit in pair and work together, right? So maybe from your view, having done this so many years, what are some of the great benefits of pair programming, and also the one that you see succeed really well here in Vidio?
I mean, certainly onboarding knowledge transfer, in terms of not having, when you have 2 people working on the same project and having a deep understanding of the code base, your bus count is reducing, right? I think that also there are subtle aspects of it that aren't obvious from the outside, in terms of also mentorship, right? When you're working with someone more senior than you, mentorship isn't only when you have a one-on-one with your manager, right? If you are working together, that is an aspect of mentorship that's a softer skill that people don't, see intuitively from the outside. And so, I mean, pair programming is one of the many sort of practices within the extreme programming that we were using. I think that now, with regards to the world of AI, I think that programming, in terms of like writing, the code is we're becoming more abstract layer on top of it, right?
Yeah.
We're not writing. I'm curious, have you ever written assembly?
No.
Yeah? Have you written C?
Yes.
Okay.
C++, not C directly, but C++.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, I don't think you're ever going to write C again, or C++,
Yeah.
But we're kind of like layers abstract on top, right?
Yeah.
And so as that abstraction layer continues to rise, there's still that huge, the activity of 2 people fleshing out, what do we want to get done? How do we want to get it done? One aspect of pair programming that I think is very hard to translate now in terms of the AI thing is is we used to do a lot of ping pong pairing where it's like I write a test and then you make it pass and you write a test and then I make it pass, which was quite enjoyable. And that's why Pivotal, when they IPO'd, at some point they IPO'd, they all had like ping pong paddles because it was, you know, part of how they did engineering.
Right.
And that is a bit harder in terms of the you know, with an AI agent and stuff, unless you really lock it down. But that said, you know, extreme programming is, there's a quote from Martin Fowler that's if you're doing extreme programming the same way you were doing it a year ago, you were not doing extreme programming, right? Because it's just constantly about assessing what is working in your organization. If it's working well, what does it mean to take it to 11, you know? And an aspect of that pair programming is just a component of two people thinking on the same problem. How do we take that to 11, right? And we're adapting that in the new world. So.
Right. Yeah, definitely the world has changed because of the AI, especially in programming, software development, right?
Yeah.
AI seems to be like a huge disruptor, I would say, a huge leverage as well for some people. So maybe if I can ask you now, your pair programming practice, how has it changed with this AI? Which part that you think will get reduced? Maybe like, you know, the ping pong thing, the test writing, but what part that gets more leverage?
Yeah. Well, I do want to correct a little bit, because you said in your pair programming practice, which is, that's not, our practice is a bit more on the extreme programming, which is many things, right?
Right.
Which is a component of values and then principles and practices that practices, pair programming is a practice, right? And practices are defined by principles. And principles are sort of driven by values, and these lead into each other. And that pair programming aspect is certainly changing, but the other components of communication, of transparency, of fast feedback, I think that a lot of those are just as true as they were 10 years ago. One thing that I think is changing a bit, that an experience that both Moen and I had, is as we were working for Pivotal, the office we were in got sold to a Japanese company, a digital garage, and we had the opportunity to work with Eric Ries a bit. And Eric Ries was well known for his book, The Lean Startup. Yeah. And I think that as writing code becomes more commoditized, many aspects of extreme programming are still valid, but other aspects in terms of building a product are becoming more valued. And so I think that there's a bit of a mesh that we're seeing in terms of engineers becoming a bit closer to being able to take on a bit more of product and objective of what is the goal of this individual component or feature that we want to do. And at the same time, also engineers, you know, a solo person can launch a company now, you know, OpenClaw or whatever, and they need to have that product sense in terms of what they're building, right? And the lean startup is a very good way to validate that, right? Because Musk has some quote around, you know, one of the biggest problems engineers have is like over optimizing something, right? And a common problem is optimizing something that shouldn't exist. Yeah. You know, and so sort of those lean startup principles are, you know, validating the product, getting it out there, getting feedback. And so us learning from that sort of Eric Ries investment / organization, I think is also is quite influential into where we're going, right? We're also seeing that sort of product mentality. We're also seeing here in video as well, in terms of product managers and designers are starting to code a bit more, right? And because it's opened that up for them. Yeah.
So XP as a practice, right? I think we all know as a software craftsmanship, it brings a lot of value. We can see it produces great culture, you know, great set of engineers and great quality output, right? And not just that, I think when you see XP practitioners, they are highly regarded as a software craftsman, right? But I don't see in the industry it is widely practiced, widely used. My question is, like, how did you sell XP back then? Like, you know that this will work at video, and the other aspect is why is it not widely practiced, you know, around the industry?
So You asked about XP and how it is practiced but not wholly practiced across the industry, and how we were able to sort of apply it to the team that we were building. And when you join a team, I think you get a runway of trust that works for a certain period of time. And we were able to, through focusing on MVPs, through focusing on sort of like lean startup principles, we were able to get something out and to deliver results, which is what the business is focused on.
Yeah.
And from that, we gained more trust and gained more leeway. But there's that Ben Horowitz quote that we mentioned, which is how startups tend to be like result focused, and equally important is not necessarily what you get done, it's how you get it done. And while Mohan and I in the leadership were very focused on delivering results, we were also incredibly, from the team perspective, we were very focused on how we delivered those results. And in understanding that we were building a scalable platform. And the word scalable so frequently in tech is with regards to the number of requests or anything like that.
Yeah.
Which for me is not what I'm referring to. It's the scalable in terms of after you grow and develop this platform for a certain number of weeks, months, years, it isn't falling over, right? And a component of XP definitely supports that, which is with regards to the test-driven development, right? Which is equally as important in XP as pair programming, or even more so, in the way that you're building a system. Sometimes I think about programming as like you can write a script and it's kind of one way, but if you're writing it through in a test-driven development manner, you're writing code that creates that output, but it's also validating the output, so it has that feedback loop.
Yep.
And feedback is a core principle of extreme programming. And feedback in terms of that feedback loop, in terms of the code that you're writing, the feedback loop in terms of having a CI that's running all of those tests, feedback loop in terms of if you are pair programming or working very closely with people, that human feedback loop.
Yeah.
In terms of like maybe we don't, So I think that the XP there, we were able to apply the principles that work, show results, build on those, and to continue to grow. I think a very tricky thing in engineering, now if you ask McKinsey, they'll have a different opinion, but is to measure like ROI or measure productivity of engineers. And fundamentally, I think that it is damn near impossible to do that. I do think that the DORA metrics are relatively useful, but they aren't, an organization tries to like measure people at the individual level, and that's incredibly hard. And DORA metrics don't do that. Instead, they're looking at how is your engineering organization running efficiently?
Yeah.
The deploy time, the mean to correct errors, to roll back, all that. I think those are still very valid, right? I think things that when someone writes a blog post that says, yes, we have figured out how to measure engineering productivity, I think that's very clickbaity because many of the other non-DORA aspects of that, I don't believe so much. One of the other aspects of that are highlighted is in terms of like developer happiness, which is valuable, right? But one aspect of that McKinsey post is around, how many engineers are looking for jobs or how many engineers are being approached. And I take great pride in when we started the organization here and engaged with a few headhunters, is that essentially Vidio was, back then we were under a different name, but was one of the top listed companies of people wanting to work with the engineers and poach from us, right? Which for me is potentially an indication of, developer productivity and success there.
Yeah. And not to mention also the culture, right? Because people want to work in a great culture company. So I think, you kind of like mentioned a little bit like why companies should invest in XP. And I like the quote, the Ben's quote, like you should not just focus on getting things done, right?
But it's how you get them done.
How you get them done.
Yeah.
And I think it's more applicable now in this AI era, because I'm sure you have heard a lot of people thinking that AI can, produce results fast, doing vibe coding and all that. But not necessarily the quality is always best, especially if you want to talking about scalable, right? If you want to evolve the systems that you built over weeks, years,
Yeah.
decades and all that, right? I think it will be tricky if you don't have all these core practices in place.
I do think that we need to stay away from grandstanding though, that, AI produces like lower quality code and stuff.
Right.
I think that what I'm happy we've done here is set some boundaries in terms of people being able to vibe code things. And so as I mentioned, we have, some designers vibe coding products. We have engineers certainly using AI assisted code in terms of our development. And I don't want to limit and prevent and say that, all this vibe coded stuff is going to have massive security issues and all of those things, which it will. But what we've done here is create a little bit of a sandbox where we allow designers and people who typically aren't writing code to produce products that can be used by our organization internally. And so we just have those behind an IAP and they're essentially walled off from the outside internet. I don't need to worry about, huge security issues there. If we were to take one of those and then give it to our users in production, I would be definitely more worried, right? But in terms of internal tools that can make our team more efficient and stuff, that's an area where if it works, it works.
Right. Yeah. I think this goes back to the lean startup principles as well, right? When you see a problem, maybe using your product approach, build something, validate that, whether there are people using it, find it beneficial and all that. Obviously, productionizing something is a different level, right?
Yeah.
Especially if used by external customers. So I think thanks for adding that. Speaking about AI tools, what have Vidio done in their engineering team? What kind of tools have you implemented? Maybe if you can share some success stories, failure stories, that would be great.
I guess let me start with a failure, and it was potentially me, not listening to the sort of lean startup principles of it, which is AI and LLMs are great at producing code and SQL particularly, right? And so early on we created a sort of text to SQL. An inside chatbot, right, where anyone in our organization could chat and it would query our data lake and get them results and all of that. And that was essentially I have heard of success of democratizing data and giving people access there, but it didn't work in our organization because once it's wrong once or twice, then there's no trust there, and it was fundamentally easier for someone just to poke a data analyst and tell them. And it's also because of accountability, right? If someone's just talking with a LLM and then getting some data results, it's a lot easier to say, well, I got the information from X, this person, and so they're accountable. So I think that that was us failing by building a product and tool that actually our organization didn't need because they already had data analysts that could answer those questions. On the success side, I think that we have had gains in terms of using at Vidio. Our first usage of AI is jokingly around an intern, which means like a child intern for the non-Indonesian speakers. And using, a lot of our video streams don't have SCTE markers, right? So typical terrestrial streams or that are live stream video that's coming along, sometimes it'll have digital markers in terms of where an advertisement starts, the break starts and ends. And initially we would potentially have humans, not intern AI, clicking and then doing TVC replacement there in areas where it wasn't digitally transcoded for that replacement. And then starting to use models, right, that are trained in terms of here's an ad break, here's not an ad break.
Yeah.
And so I think that the AI in video, and we've gone much farther than that, right, in terms of using AI models to detect sentiment within videos, to identify characters, identify, for metadata labeling and all of that. I think that it's most important to start from seeing a pathway of this is a flow of information, or this is a this is a process that we have, and then using AI to then automate it and make it faster and better, right?
Right.
That's where we've had more success.
Right. How about in development? Are you full into, having everyone having license to, whatever AI coding assistant tools, or are you using as like a new, like when you do pair programming, is AI now is like third person, like maybe in software development, what have you done?
In the development space, I think that it's gone through a few sort of step changes, I'd say, right? Like initially with the GitHub Copilot and stuff, I was never really impressed, and the team was never really impressed with those tools, because that was typically kind of like one way of like, you have our code base, you potentially can load a portion of it in your context, you can help answer questions in that regard. Obviously the model's been trained in terms of how to write a for loop and all of those things. It is very useful there, but in terms of working with a larger code base, it wasn't as impactful. I think there was a very serious step change when I learned about Kleinbot, which I believe was a tool that was created from some ex-Claude engineers. I believe they worked at Anthropic and then started Kleinbot, which was, what it was the sort of copilot on all of that, LLM for coding, but it was also connected with a bunch of pre-prompt layers where it was, I'm going to ask you about this code, and what you're going to do is you're going to check this memory bank for this information about our system. You're going to give me these recommendations and all that. We're going to talk about it, work about it, and then you're going to update that memory bank. Then you're going to update our coding styles. And that is creating a feedback loop. And that feedback, for me, that was a step change in terms of it's not just a one-way street to Copilot, it's a feedback loop. And so then we started using LLMs and AI much more significantly, because then it's also improving your documentation, which is also improving the recommendations and so forth. Right. And then, so that feedback loop is valuable. And now I think we've kind of gone with the newer models that are just so incredible in terms of being able to run much longer and have much more of a context window. I don't know where we are. I do know that we definitely enjoy using Claude Code more, the engineers. I think that it's a lot of success there has also been in terms of like, here is a pattern that I have identified within our system, be it of the 20 different apps that we have, or services that we have. Here's a pattern that we use, and we are inconsistent in terms of the application of that pattern, and help me apply it to this other place, help me apply it to that other place. And that is an area where we've had success as well in those kind of, those refactorings or those sort of like pattern translations.
Right. Speaking about these patterns, do you actually encode them as like, I don't know, prompts, or maybe skills? These days Claude has support for skills, or some kind of like agent MD or whatever. Is there any such practice where you encode these patterns?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly use our DevOps team is actually quite good in terms of they've created a layer for an MCP to help document, the various aspects of the infrastructure that we're running, and what services are best at certain things, right? And so that MCP has been useful. Also, a great MCP with regards to, our data lake in terms of the thousands of tables that we have and what you can find where, right? So those MCPs have been useful. They don't cure cancer, but in terms of, like a bigger factoring in that regard, that would be something that would be, someone on a branch and defining it, writing it into some UML potentially, and defining the problem within some sort of memory bank files, however those be named, and selectively applying those to pieces of the code. But that would be grounded with, test-driven development, steering some of these LLMs towards. It's very easy to talk to them, and then they write the code, and then massive, huge chunks of code, and then later they write massive, huge chunk of tests. And it's kind of the opposite, putting the cart before the horse. And so employing them and working with them from the engineering perspective, certainly applying our principles is still valuable.
Right. Speaking about AI, I'm sure many people in software development are quite scared.
Yeah.
I myself also fear one day, I'll be obsolete, because this model tends to improve significantly,
Yeah.
week by week, month by month. And in fact, we can see every time Anthropic release a new thing, the stock market even could drop.
Yeah.
The SaaS, the security products and all that. For you as a tech practitioner for many, many years, and in fact, you are also someone who is trained in, great engineering practice and all that. What's your view about the impact of AI? Would you think now that with this AI, you don't need so many engineers, you can cut number of engineers, or do you think it's more like an amplifier that you can even increase number of engineers or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, my conversation with the business is all of look at how much more we can get done. Look at all of these opportunities that we can pursue that we wouldn't otherwise be able to, right? So it's more on the amplifier side of things. Video is we try a lot of things, and some of them fail, some of them don't. What's important is that we don't invest too much in any individual features or products. We put it out there with minimum viable product, and we see the result, and then we double down, right? If it's working. So certainly it has been an amplifying aspect, right, of what we were able to get done and what we were able to experiment with, right? I think that it is scary in the sense that, both we have spent considerable time learning the syntax of various languages and stuff. And that is something that I'm sure many people are having existential crises in terms of, all of that is no longer valuable. I think that I started writing code because I did like to get things done, and I like to see the result, right? And it's just a tool in that process. And I too feel a little bit disheartened in terms of, the amount of time that I've spent coding that syntax is no longer important. But I need to also remember that, wow, I can have an idea now and get it out so much more easily, right? Yeah. So I think that we should, talking with the team, we were talking about pair programming and stuff, and we're doing less programming and more, I hate to say prompting, but leveraging the tools to get things done.
Right. So maybe speaking about culture, video culture, what are other things that you think are unique to video and that you're proud of? Maybe other practices that you have, apart from, those things that you have mentioned, like the XP practices, the AI usage, the experimenting that you have. Any other culture that you want to highlight here?
Your question was about unique aspects of, of video's engineering culture. I think one thing that has been valuable in terms of building video's engineering culture is we did start with that pair programming. We did start with small teams, and when you have pairing and when you have a good distribution of knowledge within the team, where you don't have silos of this guy knows that thing and he's the only person that knows it. When you build that resiliency in terms of multiple people knowing what's going on in a place, then it's easier to move people around between teams. Now, certainly we have experts who focus on, we do have some engineers who are focused on just video transcoding, right? And that is not necessarily applicable to other parts of the business. But when you have engineers who are not necessarily wed to a particular component of the system because they've built it with others and they're pairing, what you can do is you can move engineers between teams more easily. And so that has been a valuable tool for me as an engineering leader, in the sense that I can see someone who potentially is getting a bit bored on the current team with the particular problem that they're solving. That doesn't mean that they're not necessarily putting in the work, but I can see that they're not learning as much new within that domain. And so then I can move them to another team. And when we create a culture where moving between teams is quite normal, then it's easier to maintain someone's interest. And when, I had an engineer who early on was just exceedingly good in a particular area, and I didn't necessarily have a career growth roadmap of, oh, now these engineers are going to report into you, now this is going to happen. And so instead the way that I dealt with that was by to try and move him to another team that was a bit more, in this example, it was a bit more ML focused, and the trending things, so he could at least get some knowledge there, right? I remember my dad used to always tell me, you need to work at a company, you need to either earn, yearn, or learn, right? And I'm trying to pay my engineers the best I can, but in terms of yearning in terms of just like loving the company, fortunately, we do have a product that is quite fun in cases, in terms of we do have some entertainment, but the one thing that I have the most control over is learning, right? And so being able to make sure that someone in their career is constantly learning from others, and it's not always going to be forever on one team. You need to keep people mentally challenged, right? So that's one aspect of our culture of moving people around that I think has been valuable. To that extent, to double click on it further, is we have team leads, right? And we use the phrase of someone being an anchor, right? And I think it's quite unique that here the team leads are not always the most senior person on the team. And because if it's the most senior person on the team, then, well, age is linear. And so it doesn't really rotate. So what we do is a lot of times we have team leads who are, experienced, but it could be someone who's hungry and learning in that space. And so then you have a more senior person on the team who can back lead them as the team lead. And so that's another opportunity, instead of switching someone from one team to another team, but is to potentially rotate the team lead such that they can play a different role within that team. And then that's mentally and intellectually challenging for them while it's still, bettering our business, right?
Speaking about learning, I think thanks for sharing all these great things, right? Because we tend to forget that you have to build a culture where the people in your team is learning, right? Yeah. Touching a bit back to AI about learning, right? Because a lot of people now also have the fear we are not learning as much as possible. If all we do is just prompting, asking questions to AI, and this model gets smarter, but we don't necessarily get smarter because we don't have critical thinking. We don't, in fact, worse, if we don't validate the output that AI is doing. How do you prevent this in your team? How do you prevent, like, for example, AI slop that the team is producing? Because, it's so easy now to produce anything. Within just a few prompts, you can, generate something. Like, how do you prevent people to stop learning and producing crap output?
Well, I think that's something that individually people need to be responsible for, right? It's very hard for me to, if I've heard of some interviews and so forth where the interviews have anti-AI tools to make sure that, you can't use AI in the interview and stuff like that. And to me, that sounds a little bit like banning calculators, right? And so I think it's important to use the best tools that you can at any time, right? And so I'm not going to, that said, with regards to like brain plasticity and all of these things, if someone is offloading their thinking to an AI tool and not thinking themselves, then it's really hard for me to inspect whether or not they are offloading that thinking. Right. Critical thinking is important, not just in so many aspects of life, right? A funny aspect in terms of producing slop, don't know if I'm making the cut, is, we have built a culture of people wanting high quality results. And the minute, you allow some slop, be it, human generated or AI generated, that you allow some slop to come through, then the ball rolls downhill, right? People, new engineers come on and then they see this slop and then they reproduce that slop and it keeps getting worse, right?
Right.
And I remember once a person on our team, in us having built the culture of constantly trying to raise the bar and or at least maintain it, right? Someone was so passionate on our team with regards to the work that someone else produced. They were looking at reviewing someone's work and called it haram because they said that this is not of the quality that you are being paid to produce, and so it's essentially you being lazy and not putting in your full responsibility as a Muslim, and so I think that it was just indicative of both of those engineers are still in our team, but I think that it was indicative of the passion that someone had for defending a code base and not allowing just garbage to come through.
Yeah. Yeah, culture is definitely very important, right? When you have these people setting the bar that everyone should meet, right? You know, it gets replicated very easily. Same thing happens if you start, producing worse quality, right? Your culture will also degrade.
There's that. What's the phrase? And correct me if it's you can have speed, quality, cheap. You can have it fast, quality, cheap, and but then another aspect of that is the scope.
Yeah.
Right. And so in terms of there's the fast is one that I will compromise on, right? In terms of like this may take a while. There is the cheap, well, we're within our budgets, however they are, but the quality is not one that I will sacrifice on. But the one that engineering leads need to be most careful of is with regards to the scope.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a direct quote from the extreme programming. And so is we need to be very careful. And that is the lever that we need to play with.
Speaking about setting the quality standard, right? Sometimes it's very hard to define, but is there any metrics that you guys always look at to ensure that, okay, we can see it dropping, that people should, get it back up? Is there any metrics or some kind of?
Yeah, metrics are always, I think that some of those, certainly, early on, people can take, what is it, Goodhart's law, which is that anytime any metric becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good metric.
Yeah.
And I have heard of teams concerned with regards to lines of code that are covered in test in those things. And I think that the metrics in terms of quality that we are most focused on is we do have blameless postmortems, right? And whenever something goes wrong and you're having a postmortem, ideally it's not one or two things that failed. It's like 6 or 7 things that failed, right? When a plane crashes, it's not one failure.
Yeah. And
so I think that it's in that review of what are all of the causes that we go through as a team, blamelessly, and that is where we look at, potentially an aspect of the system was built, rarely, it could be true, but rarely are we framing it with someone, did a bad job or someone, dropped the quality bar.
Right.
Because it's always under the understanding of, quality is a function of time that was spent on it, right? And so, but we look at them from those postmortems from that angle, and it's there where we decide. Now, certainly, if you're I saw you had a great interview with your code as a crime scene, and that's an area where you can step back and look at the metrics and see whether something's being changed too frequently, and potentially, so there are potential quality metrics that could be looked at in terms of design of code or design of systems, right? But it's nuanced and everyone's contextual, right? Certainly like downtime and uptime of systems, those DORA metrics in terms of, the time to recover and all of those but those are more an aspect of the team having produced a system that has quality, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily like, is that line of code high quality?
Yeah. I like that you touch on, blameless postmortem, right? Coming back to like psychological safety within a team, and also the systems, right? It's not like one component, versus the whole thing working together. So maybe I want to switch gear a little bit now, speaking about, content, what Vidio is doing. I must say that I'm also a Vidio user. It is a very nice app, comparable to, all other streaming apps out there, the Netflix and all that. The quality is quite good. But speaking about the content industry itself, we all know that there's a major competition about this. And also the AI now can produce seemingly great content as well. Yeah. What do you think is the changes in this content landscape? What do you see happening within maybe the next 1 year or so?
Well, I mean, it's been for the past, 15 years, well, not 15, maybe past 10 years where we've seen auto-generated content on YouTube, right? And it's very easy to have in the publishing space. It's very easy to have auto-generated articles, and I think in the news space, those auto generations have been around for a long period of time. I think that it's where the content space is going is you can look back at sort of the publishing industry.
Right.
And so like the Wall Street Journal, maybe 50 years ago, the Wall Street Journal was probably 80% advertising in terms of the revenue that they were receiving was from advertising, and 20% subscriptions. And back then, the physical newspapers that people were buying. And now it's shifted to advertising is much smaller and much more on the subscription side. And given that news articles and the articles being written in the Wall Street Journal can be auto-generated very easily and very quickly, and then the question is, why are people still subscribing to them?
Right.
And I think that that's an aspect of trust and of quality. And when you're reading an article from the Wall Street Journal, you don't need to worry that this thing, now granted, they can be factually incorrect or something, but you have such trust that they have high quality journalism, right? And in the video space, in VIDIO space, or in the content space, I think that YouTube has some incredibly high quality content, but it also has a sea of auto-generated kind of garbage, right? And so in the streaming space, I think that it's going to be going through a similar shift, right? In terms of the advertising component is shrinking and shifting more towards the subscriptions of, for high quality content that has been curated. Now, granted, if AI can produce high quality content that people like, then that's great. But that's not going to be a one shot, produce 10 series episodes that's good enough for Netflix, right?
Yeah, right.
I was just in India working with Jio Hotstar, or talking with them about potential collaborations, and they don't really use AI for dubbing at all. Dubbing language is a huge component in India, and they still feel like the quality isn't there, and so I think that producing content that is of the highest quality possible, because people's times are limited, and so not eroding the trust from your consumers by creating that slop for them, right? Video does have recently we just launched a series, a totally sort of AI generated series, but I don't think that it necessarily, there's a lot of fear in the industry in terms of destroying jobs or in that regard, in terms of artists and content producers. But it was a very long running series in Indonesia that was 5-6 years, 500 some odd episodes on TV. And I remember going to that production house about 10 years ago, and it was probably like 8-9 people, guys, girls, working in Blender, creating some animations and all of that. And now it's 8-9 people that are working with Vue 3, CDNs, various models, still crafting those together to tell a story. And I think that the only difference is the size of the team is about the same. The cost of the production is pretty close. I think that we're getting better in terms of reducing cost of production there, but the output is so much better. And so it's about leveraging the tools to create something that consumers want.
Right. So if I'm not mistaken, this series is called Keluarga Pak Somad, right? It's like Pak Somad's family in the English term. But this one is speaking about animated series, right? What about live movies? Because like if we see CDNs, so many people have prompted, a lot of, seemingly cool kind of like live action thing, right? Do you think it will also kind of like disrupt the industry? Like all these people, maybe the stuntmen or the background, whatever that is, right? What's your view on this?
I guess before I get into live action, one thing that I would flag is somewhat similar, I guess, is so video, a huge component of our consumers are looking at live sports. Yeah. Right. And so I could just as easily create an AI copy of, Liga 1 or EPL and have little players run around the field and kick balls. But at the same time, I think that that wouldn't mean anything to you,
Yeah.
right? So I think that I don't know how to describe that of, well, AI wouldn't work there, right? But in terms of the live action and in terms of the artist or storytelling that you're telling, I think it really just depends upon the story that you're telling. And I think that it is a tool that is useful in the process. I know we've, one of our recent original series, had quite a few zombies and all of those things, and currently right now it was easiest for them to film it with humans. Well, zombies, but the team, now that they've gotten more involved in the Keluarga Pak Somat and gotten better at AI generation stuff, is they took a few parts of it that weren't even the human aspects, but they were just, for example, like blowing up a bridge or some FX, right? And I don't think anyone can complain that, oh, that FX was replaced by, because it's all just what is the tool to make that happen, right? And so that's a tool that makes that storytelling cheaper, easier, more accessible, right? And so I think that in the content space, what's going to drive success is going to be telling good stories that are meaningful to people, that they want to follow. And artists will be involved there. I think more, I don't know about more, but certainly equally important is the storyteller. Yeah, that'll have value for a long time.
Right. I mean, speaking about all these effects, right? Visual effects. I mean, people have used a lot of tools. I mean, in some movies, in fact, even like those cheap visual effects is there, but people still watch, right? I think what you mentioned, maybe it's a kind of like true, right? People don't want to see crap movies, even though with good visual effects, right? So I think storytelling, maybe also the acting, the expression and all that, and all the props, the cinematic thing might still.
I saw an amazing example of use of AI recently. It was around for advertising of sports artists, of athletes, and who are busy many months out of the year, and in them lending their faces and their likeness to a completely different person, but then using that for commercials and TV of that regard, which is interesting place to be in.
Yeah. I'm sure people have seen, all these scammers now can also replicate people's face, people's expression easily. We'll see some more use cases, I guess, in advertising, content generation, and all that. So speaking about video, I'm sure you must be proud that it's one of the biggest streaming platform, OTT platform in Southeast Asia. Maybe to grow to that stage seems to be a lot of hard work, I assume. What are some of the memorable challenges, maybe technical challenges, or maybe, I don't know, like industry content challenges that you remember that you can share with us?
We certainly have hit scale at a few different points. I think that scale in the OTT, in the over-the-top space, you have sort of AVOD, advertising based, and then you have SVOD. And video overall has kind of shifted a bit more towards SVOD. It's a lot easier to make money when someone's paying for it.
Yeah.
But when we had very large live streams that were AVOD based, and anyone can just subscribe, can just log in and then watch those, then we have had some very interesting scale situations. And I think that one of a memorable one was like the Asian AFF, which is Asian football something games, and we've hit around 4 terabytes per second in terms of bandwidth. We've had about like 2.2 million concurrents. Now those aren't Indian Hotstar scales, but in Indonesia it was a significant portion of people that are watching. So hitting those scales, we have had to solve technical challenges, and the technical challenges aren't necessarily the technical challenges of how do we build more scalable infrastructure. It's many of them are how do we deal with our users' devices and the internet access that they have, right? So we've gone pretty far in terms of trying to use the most advanced codecs that we can to reduce the stream to make the highest quality stream that people can watch. We also have at times looked at all of our consumers and the network that they're on and give people different streams depending upon the ISP they're on, because we know that that ISP is going to be hitting sort of bandwidth constraints, right? So I'm quite proud of our ability to scale to some of those large events, and the engineering effort we've put in to make the experience better for the user that isn't necessarily on do the servers work well and stuff, but it's more meeting that user at their the technical maturity that they have on their side.
Yeah. I haven't worked in like streaming companies, especially the live stream companies. From my perspective, it must be very stressful whenever there's a live event. It could be live sports, entertainment, whatever that is, with higher number of users. Is it stressful for you? Like how do you actually ensure a large scale event go seemingly smooth, less issues? Or if there's any issue during the show, how do you actually ensure that you can recover really fast?
Well, I'd be lying if I were to say that it hasn't been stressful for me. There certainly have been some stressful times. But one thing that we do benefit quite a bit from, as I mentioned, that sort of AVOD, SVOD space, right, is video does have a lot, we have a lot of free-to-air TV that people can watch. So kind of like YouTube Live, I believe in the States and so forth, is people can subscribe to video and basically watch the equivalent of a bunch of cable TV channels that are 24-hour running, right? And so from that, we have that prime time boom, and we have that standard sort of the daily sort of rise and fall of people going to bed and then waking up and wanting to check the news and or watch kids stuff in the morning. They turn it on for their kid, and then they're at work, and then maybe during lunch break they're watching.
Yeah.
So video typically on an average day has about an 11x dynamic range of people, the prime time people watching and then going down. So that's where I feel like it's actually been quite a bit of our benefit, in the sense that when we have had big premium sports things that people want to watch, I'm already used to this dynamic range here, right? So then and to see your system as it scales from that 11x, then it's a bit easier to understand, how it's going to scale on the other side of things. And that's because on that 11x, you're obviously going to be optimizing in terms of not overcapacity and running things very efficiently, right? So from that, you can extrapolate a bit more in terms of how to run the bigger events at scale. Yeah. We have hit some hard limits there. Yeah, we've hit some. I remember once we had, we needed to, like, Redis. We were running some Redis, and it was starting to hit sort of operations per second limits. And we had a big incident where we already sort of went through the playbooks of, okay, if we're running into capacity limits, how we would scale up, spawn another instance and run there. And those capacity limits weren't tested at peak load of spinning up another Redis. That was definitely an issue that we've run into.
Right. Like one thing that I would imagine, because all these, like not all, I mean like some of these streaming platforms are now going into the live streaming thing. I remember like Netflix is doing maybe the first big live stream. They have like Mike Tyson against, Jake Fury, Tyler Fury, I forgot his name. But
Jake Paul.
Jack Paul, sorry, yeah. It's like the number keeps increasing, as the rounds go by, right? How do you actually plan for such event that you didn't even anticipate before?
Yeah, I think that I certainly watched Netflix from the tech side of things as that live stream. That was Jake Paul versus Tyson was their largest single day signups ever. And I think they had around 60 million concurrent, and that's from a podcast the CTO of Netflix gave.
Right.
And so they had those 60 million concurrent, and we have never hit that scale, so that's fine. But for video scale, I think that dynamic range, that load testing that we do, that we get to do naturally from that rise and fall, has benefited us quite a bit. Well, it's mainly the fact that we have that dynamic load that comes all the time. And we will have, I remember before video, actually, when I was working at MTech, we had, when it was just the publishing platforms, some celebrity, some art, popular celebrity died, and we saw more traffic in that one day than people wanting to read the articles and all of that. So you can't plan those deaths, but you can optimize a system at its peak in those loads, and yeah, optimize around that.
Where do you see the industry is moving towards? Like maybe because you have seen in the last few years, and maybe a little bit of glimpse of what is coming, with maybe using AI more. Where do you see the industry is going?
Actually, maybe I could circle back on that dynamic one a bit.
Oh, okay.
So one benefit that video gets from being, we're mostly now SVOD, but we still have users who can come in and just watch sort of like TV on video. And so we have that AVOD aspect, which is very lightweight in terms of people can just sign up and watch without even subscribing, right? And so we get that. It's easier, we get that free consumer that, and there's obviously then a lot more scale there, right? Which is why Hotstar has massive scale. They do have tons of subscribers, but they also have the majority of the revenue is coming from advertising base.
Right.
And I think a big differentiation between us and Netflix in that regard is to Netflix, if you are to play a single video on Netflix, you need to log in, subscribe, right? And so when they have that walled garden of a credit card or whatever payment process, then that really prevents them from having to optimize for that advertising base that is just so much higher throughput, right? And I think that in the OTT space, I've seen organizations rise and fall. And I remember I was on the stage in Bali once at an event talking at a advertising event. It was called APOS Tech, and it's quite a fancy event. And I was on stage with Hooq and View and iFlix and then Vidio, and half of those companies are dead now. And it was Hooq, which was a joint collaboration between Singtel and other partners in the area. I think maybe even Sony, and then you had iFlix, which was invested and expanded in SVOD throughout the area. And I think it's very difficult for those companies that start out SVOD and start out where every user is going to be paying this much. And so as long as the user is going to be paying, let's say $1 a month. And so that as long as our costs are, let's say, 50 cents, per user or whatever, then, they can optimize it. But what that does is that means that the business, and they're going to try and grow quickly, is they're going to use vendors and they're going to use a lot of third-party services, and they want to keep quality high. So they're going to use a lot of third-party services to get the highest quality out there as soon as possible. But then what happens if you were to scale to start adding advertising as a mechanism for people to consume your service, then you went from $1 a month down to 2 cents. And now, as you scale massively, there's a funny phrase, it's what we lose on margin, we make up in volume. And it's funny because it doesn't make any sense. And it just means that you are going to be massively hemorrhaging money. And of those on the stage, that Hooq, iFlix, View, and Vidio both started out on the advertising space. And then we've moved into the subscription model. And the Hooq and the iFlix, and even Netflix, has introduced the advertising space. And I think Hooq and iFlix have died, and I think Netflix will be fine. Obviously, they're a pioneer in the space, and they've such an incumbent. But in this market, and in certain parts of the world, the ability to subscribe and pay is reduced, and that's why Netflix has added that advertising space to expand their business. So I think that having that high efficiency and being very critical of every dollar that you're spending on a third party is incredibly important to ensure the success of your company. Now, I think we're going to also see the same thing in the whole AI space, right? You have, and granted, Claude or Anthropic and OpenAI, I think that both of those are the Netflix incumbents, right? So I think that, it's interesting to see that, but even, who's the founder of OpenAI?
Sam Altman.
Sam Altman, talking about him firing back at Anthropic of, we have more customers in Texas than Anthropic has customers, right? Which is, it does show that scale is incredibly important. And because they're more advertising based and they're going to start adding, more ads. And I think that Anthropic being subscription only based, again, I think that right now what's important in the AI is the quality and being able to subscribe. But I think that when we start talking about companies that are built on AI and are bringing AI to a very niche product market and stuff, I think that we will see some of them, there are some jokes around, like tell me you have an AI company and then show me your open AI bill, it depends on the level at which I think it can be great to jumpstart your company and to solve the problem in that space. But I think that you're not a tech company unless you're thinking about every time where you're employing AI there. And okay, maybe that could be not even an individual model. Maybe that piece of the system could be some rule set. You know what I mean? That costs, literally, nothing compared to tokens.
Yeah.
Right? I think that people need to, what's the NPM module that's like using AI to check whether something's is odd,
Yeah, I don't know.
But the extreme cases where using AI in areas where it is inefficient.
Yeah.
And so there will be so many places where companies are able to bring huge LLMs and into certain domains and evoke efficiency and help improve people's lives. But they won't survive forever if they're beholden entirely to a third party.
Yeah, certainly when people refer to maybe AI bubble, we see a lot of AI products out there, right? But if all they do is just like wrapping on top of, whatever AI model that they use, probably that's a bit of trouble. Maybe in the future, if this model changes in terms of capability, the price
If they
also
raise the
changes.
rate,
Yeah. So definitely a good advice for people who are building AI products these days.
Technically, one thing that, one area where video is beholden to is, 50% of our cost are network delivery, right? So, that is a huge aspect. And initially we used one CDN and optimized on that. And I think that it was painful to go multi-CDN, but it unlocked the ability where I wasn't beholden to a particular vendor, and I was able to say, well, I can just move this over tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe in the AI space we need to think about that, is if you do use, AI and you're not running or building your own LLMs and things like that, is maybe being vendor agnostic certainly unlocks the skill of being able to negotiate between vendors.
I think you have mentioned a couple of potential trends coming, like for example, I like the discussion about the subscription versus advertising, creating more AI generated content or AI being used in generating content in software development as well. Is there any other trends that you pick up that probably you can share for us here?
Given the current date and time right now, which is what we're mid-February in 2026, I think that it is impossible to avoid the recent trend of the open claw and the whole agentic space.
That's
right?
the tie that you have there.
Yeah, it's a lobster tie that I've had for a very long period of time, but it is identical to a lot of open claw logos.
Right.
And on my desk you can see this Mac Mini, and I only have a stack of one, unlike the people who are trending on X who have 15 Mac Minis and all of that. So it's a lot of fun to play with, and it's interesting and an exciting area to be in with regards to that agentic letting some agent run along and burn some tokens until. But I think that the trend needs to be focused. People need to be cognizant of the Gartner hype cycle, and it's a great time to get experience and to play with all of the things that are developing in AI. And I think that it is foolish to ignore them and to not experience and see where their breaking points and their limits are, right? So I have certainly, and when you play with these things and when you technically have an understanding of how they operate, right? And nothing is magic in tech, and And I think that once you get a deep enough understanding of, okay, this agentic, the whole OpenClaw thing, right, is essentially, I mentioned earlier how we had the Copilot and then we had Klein that was feeding back into itself and getting better, right? Getting better based on markdown files, right? The limit is not sentience, but markdown files,
Yeah.
right? That's essentially all this OpenClaw is, right? Is markdown files and potentially vector, embeddings and search and stuff like that, but it's not sentience. And at least understanding how the underlying components of it can help you leverage that for what it's good at. It's good at, I have my own OpenClaw, and the first things that my friends want to do is, book some time. Tommy needs to be here at this time with me or whatever, and to remind me. And it can be very useful for getting different perspectives on certain things. But if you're gonna prompt it to go online and make money or something, then I think that you wouldn't have a good enough understanding of this is not magic that you're talking to. It's a bunch of markdown files.
Right.
Yeah.
I like it that you pick up this OpenClaw. Some people know about CloudBot, MoldBot, Moldbook and all that, but this OpenClaw is definitely one trend that is happening in the tech world. And in fact, the founder was just hired by OpenAI. Maybe we will see new evolution of this OpenClaw.
Yeah.
And definitely interesting for everyone to just understand how these evolve. The AI pace is definitely very fast, but at the same time, I think we have to, for people who are in tech, we need to understand where it's going, the limits, although it seems like the limits keep increasing day by day.
They do. Yeah. But if you have a deep understanding of it, then if AI is magic to you, then it makes sense to potentially ask, like go make money online or go cure cancer or something. Yeah. But like when you understand that it's just predicting the next word in a very oversimplified manner, right, then you can have a better expectation of what is possible, what isn't possible. Even if this word prediction gets better by several years, right, what is still possible?
Yeah, speaking of that, I remember one quote that I have with my past guests, like AI is smart until it's dumb. Like one day you'll find it dumb. It's like, oh, it's not magic after all.
Yeah.
Right. So Tommy, I think we have covered a lot of things. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up pretty soon. In my podcast, I have a tradition to ask all my guests, this question called the 3 technical leadership wisdom. Think of it just like advice that you want to give, maybe for people, engineers, tech practitioners out there. Maybe you can leave your version today. That would be great.
Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and I've read all of his books. I love his books. And in one of his, I think it's The Tipping Point, where he talks about how practitioners who become excellent in a particular area, that 10,000 hours, right? And how Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, at that time when they happened to be really at the right place at the right time in terms of having access early on to technology. And then obviously they took it upon themselves to play with it and learn and love and, just absolutely pour time into and then get those 10,000 hours. I think that mastery of, any skill takes time. And I think that as people who embrace, our new LLM overlords, but people who have successes and failures and leverage these tools and then see what works and then build on that. I think that is as true as it ever was. And so these tools are something that, shouldn't necessarily be feared, but people need to be respectful of the Gartner hype cycle of not getting too overzealous and keep focusing on the outcome of is it helping you get done what do you want to do, and double click on that, and double click on solving real people problems as opposed to optimizing something that or creating something interesting.
Any other? Or that's it?
I think those are I think that's the only one I have.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I believe the definition of mastery will change definitely with AI, right? Because there are so many things that AI, and in fact, for example, if I want to get into a new thing, new domain, new understanding about something, it's very easy to pick up from AI. But definitely mastery here doesn't mean that I know more things now because of AI, right? Mastery is something that you have done, experiment, fail. I think it's a big part of that mastery as well. So I think definitely the future is going to be different. So yeah, Tommy, thank you so much for your time today. I think learn a lot about, your practices, building culture, which I think is quite admirable. Video is, I think, one of the big tech products within this region. Wish you all the success out there. And yeah, thanks for sharing everything that you have today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a learning experience for me as well, chatting with you. Thank you.